when you walk through the doors of Boca Chica on the west side of St. Paul,
Muy bien, muy bien. Solo quería avisar
you're
que
stepping
estamos acá
into
en el
Minnesota's
Café.
oldest Latino
Es
business.
solamente audio, no hay video. Sí. Ok, gracias.
The Mexican restaurant was opened in 1964 by two Mexican immigrants, Guillermo and Gloria Frias. It is still family-owned and operated. Boca Chica's location on Cesar Chavez Boulevard in St. Paul marks the entrance of the West Side Cultural Corridor, a vibrant and diverse business and cultural district just across the river from downtown. St. Paul's West Side has long been home to a large Latino and Hispanic community, and this community is visually apparent as you walk through the neighborhood.
Well, let's go over here, maybe there is something.
And not just because of its grocery stores and businesses and restaurants like Boca Chica,
The murals are back there.
Okay.
Yeah.
but because of its public art, its murals. Inside of Boca Chica, for example, there are 3 large murals.
Yeah, so this mural is based on a mural that exists in Mexico City, and it describes the creation of human beings.
This is local muralist Aaron Jonson-Ortiz, who showed me around inside Boca Chica, starting with the first mural that you can see on your right as you enter the dining room.
It addresses the creation of human beings based on corn. Mm-hmm. It's not just something that you eat, but it's very much the building blocks of what makes us human beings.
I had reached out to Aaron to talk about how public art has shaped the west side of St. Paul. He had suggested that we meet here at Boca Chica specifically.
Part of the reason why I wanted to bring you here, I guess it was twofold. Yeah. One was just the location of the restaurant as this place that kind of opens up the West Side corridor, the connection of this restaurant to Mexicans in Minnesota generally, but also this kind of historization of our heritage, right?
As we stand in front of a mural that depicts several important political leaders in Mexican history, Aaron tells me about how Mexican muralism, or muralismo, is rooted in community storytelling. A mural in a business or on the side of a building helps the community tell a story about itself, both to outsiders, but also to members within the community.
In some ways, I feel like that's what the murals in this space do, which is just sort of allow stories to be told to kids and future generations.
Muralismo got its start in Mexico after the Mexican Revolution, following 10 years of political conflict from 1910 to 1920. The newly installed Mexican government began commissioning murals to help create a sense of national unity. Many people in Mexico were illiterate at the time, and so murals were used as a way to teach history. This type of storytelling is still a huge part of Latin American culture and education.
English is very different from Spanish, hard to teach. In Latin America, it's still be taught with like oral history and a lot of storytelling. And when you take the storytelling away from the students, you're not being culturally competent.
This is Norma Garces. She is the director of Academia Cesar Chavez in St. Paul, which is featured in Profe, a new documentary from Twin Cities PBS about 2 Spanish-language schools in Minnesota. As Garces points out in the film, being able to see yourself reflected in your education, in your neighborhood, in your community, creates a strong sense of identity for a young person. Murals help create that sense of identity too. And that's actually why I wanted to speak with Aaron in the first place. So how do murals shape our communities here in Minnesota? And how has Minnesota, in turn, shaped the murals that we see around us? I'm Julie Censullo, and this is Playback, the show where we hit rewind and look back on Minnesota history.
There's just a way in which the community asserted their own culture, not in an aggressive way, but simply in a way of bringing that vibrancy to the state.
Aaron Jonson-Ortiz, who showed me around the murals at Boca Chica, is a practicing muralist from St. Paul. He is also the founder and executive director of Neo Muralismo de Mexico, a nonprofit dedicated to recovering the Mexican heritage of muralism. After looking at some art on the west side, Aaron joined me back in the TPT studio in downtown St. Paul to talk more about muralism in Minnesota. Aaron, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
So I want to start off by talking a bit about your personal history with murals. How did you get into mural making originally?
Well, for me, murals have always been part of who I am. I've been drawing since I was a little kid. And even when I was a kid, my mother and my father taught me about Diego Rivera and a lot of the Mexican muralists. And actually, my mom migrated to Minnesota in the late 1960s. And the reason she came was that she lived in Mexico City and volunteered giving tours to international students of murals in Mexico City. And as a result of that work, she was offered a scholarship at the University of Minnesota. And so for me, that history, runs in my blood. And I believe muralism is one of the most accessible forms of art, but also because of the size, because of the location, it has a kind of geographic and historic weight that a lot of art forms don't have as much. And so it's something very special for me.
We are going to be using the term mural throughout this conversation a lot, and I think most people are familiar with the idea of murals as large public paintings. But you noted when we were over at Boca Chica that when you talk about murals, you're talking about a much more specific type of art form, correct?
The act of large-scale painting is something that runs in many different countries, many different histories, regions of the world. And I guess from a Mexican perspective, there's this concern about conflating large-scale painting with muralism. And for us, especially those of us who kind of come from the tradition of the 1920s and 30s of Mexican muralism, we feel that the word mural is used in a way that it's too broad. We see it as an art movement, not just as an act of painting on a wall.
I know the muralism movement dates back to the Mexican Revolution, which lasted from 1910 to 1920. How did murals start to emerge during the years after the revolution?
After what's considered the end of the revolution in 1920-21, the new government, which was a very left-leaning government, instituted a program through the Secretary of Public Education, Jose Vasconcelos, to create large-scale paintings that depicted Mexican history. And the idea was that during that time, there was a lot of people who couldn't read and write. Another important element of that time was simply the concept of bringing the country together after there had been so many deaths. And so there's a way in which Mexican muralism is an act of national healing, of overcoming trauma, of bringing communities together, of creating a sense of togetherness amongst the population when there was so much polarization. So the Mexican muralist movement had those two elements. It was about telling history, and it was about sort of healing and bringing people together.
And this was a movement that was funded by the government, right?
So in Mexico, for better or for worse, there was a kind of a centralization of public arts funding. And so 3 muralists in particular were given very large commissions. And for a mural to take place, you need a lot of public sector investing because it's very costly, it's very large, and of course you need to have access to that canvas, which is, in the case of the muralist, a very large building. And so you need permits from the government and funding. But it very much from the very beginning, it was really no different than funding the construction of schools, right? It was an initiative from the government to fund education in the country.
And where did this idea for public art in Mexico come from at this time? Because at the time, making art that was publicly available to the masses was not necessarily common practice, right?
Yeah. So there's an artist called Dr. Atl. That was his self-appointed, it was kind of his share name. He wrote a manifesto, so this was before the revolution, in which he called for sort of a transformation of painting. And he called it pintura mural, which is mural painting. It's noteworthy that before the 1920s, the word mural, both in English and Spanish, was never used as a noun. So it was always in combination with paintings. But in this manifesto, Dr. Atl asked for a kind of a change in understanding of how we connect, so that the public of art is not simply people who go to galleries or wealthy patrons, but rather art can be accessed by a much broader segment of society. Dr. Atl was never later on recognized as a muralist, but it was really his vision that informed José Vasconcelos in the 1920s to create the public art program of Mexican muralism through the Secretary of Public Education.
Mm-hmm. So there's this shift in thinking about who the consumers of art should be. How did the public receive the murals that were created through the Secretary of Public Education?
By and large, certainly if you look at the majority of Mexican society, they were in favor of this kind of vision because it reflected the rights of indigenous peoples to land, the rights of workers to a dignified living wage, and so on. So it reflected the interests of the broad swaths of society, but certain special interests did not necessarily agree with that. But public art is very controversial. And I've had this through personal experience as well. It tends to solicit a kind of emotional response that sometimes is very positive and sometimes is very negative. And so it's hard to imagine now because in Mexico, muralism has become so much part of our national identity that it's hard to imagine that it was controversial at the time. But, you know, there were stories of people showing up with guns and shooting at the murals. And so it was certainly a point of contention, and very much because it also was about how do you tell the national story, right? And so for some people, the story that was being told from an anti-colonial perspective, a somewhat Marxist perspective from the muralists was not the kind of story that they wanted to hear. And so there was both very positive reception as well as anger from some people. So in many ways, the muralist movement and the controversy around that was a sort of an extension of the conflict that happened between 1910 and 1920.
Sure, I can imagine there were still a lot of ideological differences within Mexican society following that 10-year period of conflict. We'll come back to talking about muralism, and in particular, muralism in Minnesota. But in order to do that, I want to bring Minnesota into our story. I know that the rise of muralism in Mexico was happening at the same time that we were seeing a lot more migration from Mexico into the United States. Can you tell me about some of the reasons for that migration?
The revolution was very bloody. About 10% of the population died. And there was a lot of Mexicans who fled north, in part to escape the violence, in part because the economy was in shambles. And in the United States, Mexicans were met oftentimes with violence and xenophobia. And a lot of the families that came to Minnesota during that time decided to establish themselves here in the state. So it was a period that has had an enormous impact on Mexico as a country, but also upon Mexicans wherever they might live, including in our home state here in Minnesota.
And were there Mexican communities in Minnesota before this?
So the first person who is known to have settled in Minnesota from Latin America, his name is Luis Garzón, and he was a musician, an oboist and a flute player. He was part of an orchestra. And when he came to Minnesota in 1886, it was a traveling presentation of the orchestra. And he got sick when he arrived in Minnesota. And so he was left behind by the rest of the orchestra. Then he fell in love and married and stayed here. And to me, what that story illustrates is the desire from the very beginning to share our culture in this state. So the very first immigrants, whether they were artists or not, brought culture and brought music and brought dancing and brought folkloric clothing. So that preceded the muralist movement. But even in the 1880s and 90s and the early part of the last century, there was a trickle of migration from Mexico in particular, and people who came would share their culture. It was really in the next couple of decades that the migration increased. By today's standards, it was still very low, but most of the families at that time were from either northern Mexico or they were from Texas. So, of course, there's a history of Tejanos, of Mexicans who became citizens of the United States, not by crossing the border, but as we say in our community, by the border crossing us. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of families who were Tejanos who came to Minnesota, again, looking for opportunities for work, but also escaping violence in Mexico and in the southwest of the U.S.
And so when this wave of Mexican immigrants were coming to Minnesota following the Mexican Revolution, where were they settling when they got here?
There are many different communities around the state. So Crookston in northern Minnesota was a location where a lot of Mexicans came as beet farmers to help the sugar beet industry. There was also another location in what is now Sweet Hollow, and it's known as Sweet Hollow, but it was actually the location of various different immigrant communities. But here in St. Paul, the first Latino barrio, the first Mexican barrio of the state, was established in the West Side Flats, which is essentially the area across the river from downtown St. Paul that now is the location of Harriet Island, and now there's all kinds of development there. But at the time, it was very much a working class, low income neighborhood.
I know the West Side Flats was a very diverse neighborhood. There were a lot of different immigrant communities that lived there. Can you tell me about the Mexican community of the Flats?
To me, the most interesting part from stories I've heard from the elders who are still alive today was the way in which the community, even though it was so far north from Mexico, even though it's such a small minority in the state at the time, even though most people did not speak Spanish in Minnesota, there's just a way in which the community asserted their own culture, not in an aggressive way, but simply in a way of sharing, who we are as a community and bringing that beauty, bringing that culture, bringing that vibrancy to the state. And so there's photos from that era of parades with the Virgen de Guadalupe, with mariachi. There's photos of storefronts with Mexican food items inside and artesanía crafts inside. And so that from the very beginning, there was a desire to share our culture in Minnesota.
Yeah, even back then, which I think a lot of, especially white Minnesotans, don't think of that as part of like Minnesotan history of that time.
I would go farther than that. I would say most Mexicans and Latinos are not aware of that history. Even me, I'm from St. Paul originally, and I have a Mexican heritage. And growing up, I always saw the West Side as this sort of cultural hub that I could go to, but I was not necessarily aware of the history of the West Side Flats per se, and I didn't know about the history of the displacement.
Yeah, I want to talk about that displacement that you mentioned a little bit more, because I'm guessing that a lot of the reason for this lack of community memory of the Flats is because the residents of the West Side Flats were largely displaced in the 1960s when the city relocated many community members to the part of West St. Paul where Boca Chica is today. And this was after a series of particularly bad floods in the Flats. Can you tell me what happened to the community of the West Side Flats?
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly what you're saying. In the same way that in Sweet Hollow, there was low-income housing, precisely because it was not a great place to build a building. In the Flats, there was regular floods, and so you would put up a building, and every couple of years, you would have massive damage to your property. And so for those reasons, it was always considered not a great place to live. Additionally, at the time, there wasn't the same kind of sanitation rules that we have around sewage, right? And so the river itself was not particularly clean. And so living close to the river was not necessarily a great thing. Now things have changed dramatically. Now everybody wants to live close to the river because it's a beautiful natural environment. But the city decided that that land should not be occupied. And they cited the flooding as a major concern, and which was in fact a concern that was not made up. In the 1950s and 60s, the residents were displaced, and many of them, not all of them, but many of them moved up to what is now known as Cesar Chavez Street and the surrounding community of the West Side Cultural Corridor. A lot of community members were disappointed when the city then put in a levy immediately after kicking people out and turning the area into an industrial park. And a lot of folks in the community just feel that the levy should be put up before the community was displaced.
Yeah, here is former West Side Flats resident Don Luna speaking about that in the series Lost Twin Cities from TPT.
The insult to injury was that after we moved, They built a flood wall to protect this area. We lost a piece of our history, and in many ways, a piece of who we were. That piece is gone. We can't get that back.
And as you mentioned, this is a community that had already experienced a great deal of historic displacement, a great deal of moving around. And so this is where murals and their role in building community are going to come back into play in our story.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. For the folks on the West Side Flats, but also I think Mexicans around the state, people had a desire to retell our story, to reclaim our heritage, to feel pride in who we are as a community. And so there was this sort of Chicano movement, the Mexican-American movement that came out of the 60s and 70s. And in many ways, the history of Mexican muralism was borrowed by the Chicano movement and readapted to tell the story of Mexicans on this side of the border. And that's true in Los Angeles, it's true in Texas, it's true across the country, but it's also true here in Minnesota. And that story is, multi-decade old story. And the West Side Cultural District, there were several artists from the community who painted stories of their community or of Latino history or Mexican history. And that was a way for people to create a sense of a cultural community on the West Side.
So you said that the murals on the West Side, these murals associated with the Chicano movement, are somewhat adapted from the muralism movement in Mexico. In what ways are they different from the murals commissioned by the Mexican government in the 1920s?
Yeah, that's a great question. For one thing, there was not the level of funding in Minnesota for those early murals. Now there is, but at the time, it was very much sort of commissions from restaurants, or they were initiatives from artists that were done on a volunteer basis or done with very low or small budgets. And so in many ways, they are influenced by the Mexican muralist movement, but they're also in other ways perhaps similar to urban art or graffiti. And so they have a little bit more of a grassroots perspective. And in our community, we talk about rascuache, which is sort of like something that you put something together with very few resources, right? So there's a way in which the Chicano murals were influenced by Mexican muralism, but also done in a way that was with much fewer resources.
So we've been talking about how these murals were used as a way to reclaim a communal identity over a neighborhood, especially after the displacement. Can you talk about why this strong visual identity is important for a community?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak as somebody who did not grow up on the West Side Flats, who did grow up in St. Paul as Mexican from Minnesota. For me personally, the cultural district on the West Side represents a space where our history, our cultural heritage, our art forms, our community is uplifted and represented. And I've heard that from many Mexicans from around the state who grew up in rural communities where sometimes they were the only Mexican family, or around the Twin Cities before the art movement on Lake Street. The West Side was the primary location that people looked to as a space that represented our culture. So I can speak as somebody who grew up Mexican in St. Paul and who always saw the West Side as a place where there were people like me, and there was culture that I understood, and there were art forms that I wanted to learn about because I could see myself and my family reflected in those images.
You brought up Lake Street, which is also a place that I'm sure many people associate with murals in the Twin Cities. How has muralism evolved in the Twin Cities over the years?
Yeah, and so a couple things. One is we have seen very significant growth of Mexican migration specifically, but also Central American migration, folks from the Caribbean, from South America. There's huge populations from Ecuador and Venezuela that are arriving here in Minnesota. And with each wave of migration, there's been new forms of art and new forms of culture that have been introduced or adapted to our home state. There's a kind of an explosion of public art that happened in particular in Minneapolis on Lake Street and kind of surrounding communities that happened as a result of the explosion in migration from the 1990s. And that happened simultaneously with the opening of Mexican and Latino businesses along that cultural district. And as businesses have opened, they've also wanted to depict their art and their culture on those walls. And by creating public art on the outside of the building, there's a sense in which Lake Street is very vibrant, very colorful, very alive. And it's the color of the murals that creates that sense of happiness and of joy for the community.
Right. And as you said, a lot of the Latino communities that are migrating to Minnesota today aren't necessarily Mexican, but a lot of the public art that we see, especially along Lake Street, invokes this tradition of Mexican muralism. Do you see the origins of Muralismo being lost in the way we sometimes use the word mural to just mean any large public painting on the side of a building?
So again, large-scale public art is something that many different cultures have done throughout the ages. And so for us, we always very respectful of different artists of different communities, but we also ask that history be learned, right? I paint in a style that is impressionistic, and I'm not French. I don't have any French heritage. But in the same way that I can look back to the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists as influences in my work, I know who Monet is, I know who Van Gogh is. I think it would be very unconvincing if I called myself an artist who paints in an impressionistic style if I didn't know who Monet was, right? And so for me, I always try to speak with people who use the term muralism and ask, well, at the very least, you should know who the three great muralists from Mexico are: Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. And you should know what they did, their body of work, the reasons why they created work. And of course, you can take that in whatever direction you want to as an artist. But I feel that if you call yourself a muralist, you should be aware of where muralism comes from.
I know your organization, Neo Muralismo de Mexico, supports muralists around the state. And you recently worked with an artist, Flor Soto, to create her first mural in Austin, Minnesota. Can you talk about that mural and the function of murals in more rural communities?
I think it serves the same function, which is to create a welcoming space for new immigrants as well as for folks who have been there for a while who haven't been represented. So in Flor's case, the mural itself is a representation of nature. There's a large sun, there's birds, there's root systems. There's not a lot of history in it. However, for her, it's very much a representation of Mexican culture and of migration. She talked about the roots representing, her roots as an immigrant. And of course, Austin has a lot of new immigrant populations now. I believe in the last census, it was around 17% Latino. But when we've talked with teachers in schools, a lot of the classrooms are 50% Latino or more. And so we see significant growth of our community as well as African immigrants, Asian immigrants in cities like Austin around the state. And so these public art creations create a sense of belonging for new immigrants as well as folks who have been around for a little while.
One of the things that we talked about when we were at Boca Chica and we were looking at these 3 different murals is that murals often aren't a standalone piece of work. They are usually displayed in a place where there are a lot of other different pieces of art, maybe by different artists or from different time periods, and there's often different stories that are being told. So how does that change the way that muralists like yourself create them or think about them? And how does that change the way that we as the public view them?
Yeah, I always think about mural corridors as almost like outdoor gallery for the community or a museum for the people because it's introducing art into our everyday lives. as opposed to having art in a separate space that we had to go to on a special occasion. I feel that it's a tool for oral historians. And so if you want to teach your kids about a specific history or about your own history, about your heritage as, in this case, as Mexicans in Minnesota, having public art in a corridor like Lake Street or like the West Side allows you to tell your children about your history and about symbols. So the murals themselves don't speak alone. They speak with residents, right? With families, with people who want to teach their kids about, as an example, the Mexican Revolution, or they want to talk about the history of migration to Minnesota. Those images allow parents to teach their children about those stories. It's almost like a outdoor picture book.
After Aaron and I visited Boca Chica, we went and looked at another, more contemporary mural on the west side, located under a pedestrian bridge on Robert Street.
Yeah, this mural was done in recent years, and the two artists are Ernesto Ibarra and Ashilan Balam, and they're families from the west side as well.
This mural was different from the ones that we'd seen at Boca Chica. It was more colorful, more abstract.
It's still in the footsteps of that sort of more older tradition, but it brings in color, it brings in a kind of dynamic composition. It sort of gets away from realism, and now it's more about the composition of the colors and the expression of the artist. And it's a more recent take on muralism. It's a more contemporary take.
Aaron, how do you see these different murals from different periods in time, from different artists, as all playing a role in creating a sense of community in our state?
Yeah, I'm a strong believer in a healthy arts ecosystem. And what I mean by that is that I think we have a need for large institutions, small organizations, practicing artists of every background. We need dance, we need poetry, we need everything. So I don't take a position on whether, the classic styles in muralism are better than, graffiti art forms or spray paint or anything like that. I think we need all of it. We've gotten to a place in the state in which the diversity of murals is astounding. But I want Minnesota to be a global leader of public art. And I think we have the financial infrastructure to do it. And I think we have the artists to do it. I think we have the organizations to do that. In the same way that we talk about, the interstate highway or large-scale bridges, we should be thinking about large-scale public art projects in our home state so that people in Tennessee and Argentina and China and Australia, when they learn about the history of public art, they look towards Minnesota as an example. And I think we can do it, but I think that it will require a lot of big thinking.
Aaron Jonson-Ortiz, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Playback is produced by me, Julie Censullo, with editorial support from Katie Thornton. Luke Heikela is our production manager. Lisa Blackstone is our archival producer, and Olivia Pelham is our production assistant. Eric Poggle recorded and mixed this episode. Daniel Bergen is our executive producer. Support for this podcast comes from the WEM Foundation Fund for History Production and Education. Playback is a production of Minnesota Experience Studios from Twin Cities PBS.